Certainly good to see everyone this morning. Continuing in the book of Judges, and we're going to be in chapter 6 today. So if you want to open your Bible to Judges chapter 6. In the reading that Larry just read for us before the prayer, which was in 2 Corinthians 7, Paul was asking about a thorn to be removed from his side. And the Lord, in his response to him, said, "My power is made perfect in weakness." And I think we see this as a way that God works throughout the scriptures to demonstrate his power through and in the weakness of people. And we're going to see that illustrated very clearly in the story of Gideon today. And over and over and over, in fact, it will see that. And so we'll circle back to this statement that the Lord makes to Paul, that my power is made perfect in weakness. We'll come back to that at the end, but we're going to basically be reviewing the story of Gideon. This follows chapter 4 and 5 that we looked at last week on Deborah and Jael, the female heroes of the story there, which is a really fascinating account. And we saw the song of Deborah and Barak in chapter 5. And this is just like it starts right after that in chapter 6. But if you'll notice, the very last verse of chapter 5 says there were 40 years of peace, or 40 years of rest. So a whole 40 years passes between the last of chapter 5 and the story that begins in chapter 6. So a whole new generation has come along. People that were just little kids are now the adults with kids of their own. If you can just imagine a passage of time of 40 years, a lot of stuff has changed. And as the cycle of Judges happens over and over and over, they kind of get their act together, only to fall apart the next generation and to stray away from the Lord and forget the faith of their fathers and go after other gods. And that's exactly what happens. And then God raises up an enemy to harass them. And in this case, it is the people of Midian primarily. We see in verse 1, the people of Israel did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, and the Lord gave them into the hand of Midian 7 years. The hand of Midian overpowered Israel. Because of Midian, the people of Israel made for themselves the dens that are in the mountains and the caves in the strongholds. So just to picture this is God's chosen people, the people of Israel. He had brought them with a mighty hand out of Egypt. He had led them through the wilderness, and then they had conquered this promised land. This was their inheritance. And living in their own inheritance, they're having to live in hiding, in caves in the ground, in holes and just places to stay, hidden from sight because of their enemies. And what a shameful thing that is. But it was all because they did not remember God. They did not keep their faith in God. And things usually go astray pretty quickly when we forget about our Creator and we go after other things. So the next two verses say that every time they would plant a crop, so every year when it was time, and I think they had 2 growing seasons, but whenever, they would work, and you can just imagine they would do all this work to put the crop in and then to work it and work the ground. And when it was finally time for harvest, here would come the Amalekites and the Midianites. They would just kind of descend onto the land, and they would come and just take whatever they wanted. And they're compared to locusts. So you remember how a swarm of locusts would just strip the land and leave nothing, and that's exactly what they would do. Imagine how discouraging that would be if you had worked really hard and you finally start to see the beginnings of the harvest, and then here comes this other people, and they just come in and they just take everything and they take it back to where they live, and there's nothing you can do because they're stronger than you or they outnumber you. And so that's what happened. And so as usual in this cycle of the Judges, the people cried out to God, and he raised up a deliverer for them. And this time it is Gideon, and we were introduced to him in verse 11. Now the angel of the Lord came and sat under the terebinth at Orpha, which belonged to Joash the Abiezrite, while his son Gideon was beating out wheat in the winepress to hide it from the Midianites. So this gives you just a little snapshot. It's kind of like the curtain opens on this little family scene in this farm, and they're threshing. And normally threshing would be done in the open, and the wind would carry away the things, but they're threshing in they're threshing some way out of sight. So he's working the wheat, but he's doing it in a way to try to keep it where nobody could see him, so that if some Midianite happened to be passing by, he wouldn't notice, because if he did, of course, He'd be like, oh, hey, you've got some wheat. I'll just come help myself to that. And so he's in hiding while he's doing his farm work. And verse 12, the angel of the Lord appeared to him and said to him, the Lord is with you, O mighty man of valor. Now, I don't know if angels make jokes. I really wondered about that. I don't know if this is supposed to be funny. It's sort of funny in a way because, as we'll see, Gideon is the last person you would think of to call a mighty man of valor, especially at this point. And even as you consider what he's doing, he's hiding where nobody can see him so he can work. And the angel comes along and says, oh, mighty man of valor. He doesn't look like a mighty man of valor. He looks like someone who's scared to death. And in fact, that kind of is his story. Gideon is scared all the time. At the same time, though, by the end of the story, he's going to be a mighty man of valor. Not because of who he is, but because the Lord is working through him. And so maybe it's not supposed to be funny, although it is kind of funny, but maybe it shows us that God sees in us what we can't even see in ourselves, what we can be if he's working in us and through us, what we're capable of with him working in our lives. So just like you remember when Jesus comes along and there's some people washing out their nets and he says, follow me and I will make you fishers of men. He probably knew what Peter and James and John were capable of and what they would even do for him way before they had any idea that they would stand before people and address crowds and preach and those kind of things. When they were just fishermen, he could see what they could be in his service. And so I suspect that's probably the meaning here, although it's hard to avoid that there seems to be a little bit of sarcasm, perhaps, if not a little bit of humor in this almighty man of valor working here in hiding. So verse 13, and Gideon said to him, please, my Lord, if the Lord is with us, then why has all this happened to us? And where are all his wonderful deeds that our fathers recounted to us, saying, did not the Lord bring us up from Egypt? But now the Lord has forsaken us and given us into the hand of Midian. So, Gideon, like you and me, have been raised hearing about the Bible and God's works and what God had done. He had heard those stories since he was a little kid. His mom and dad had taught him about the Exodus and how, there were the 10 plagues and Moses and all that. So he's heard all those stories, but what he sees in his day is no miracles to be seen. He sees that the enemies have overtaken them. They're just in fear and in hiding. And so he's saying, if the Lord is with us, it doesn't look like the Lord is with us. He doesn't seem to have connected the dots, which is often the problem. People don't realize, why is life so hard? Why am I suffering like this? Well, maybe it's because we are not putting God first and seeking him in the way that he wants it to. And that's the case here for them. So in verse 14, the Lord turned to him and said, go in this might of yours and save Israel from the hand of Midian. Do I not send you? And again, I think that's I don't know, is it like a little jab? What does he mean, go in this might of yours? What might does Gideon have? He's in hiding and he doesn't seem to have any power whatsoever. At the same time, God says, do I not send you? So if he will respond to this, he has all the strength that he needs. Verse 15, he says, please, Lord, how can I save Israel? Behold, my clan is the weakest in Manasseh, and I'm the least in my father's house. Just imagine that you've got this whole tribe. So, there are 12 tribes. In Manasseh, his particular family was like the weakest, So if everybody was to show up with all of their fighting men and you were to line them all up, Gideon's family is going to be like the smallest. They have maybe the fewest guys, or they're just, maybe they're not just physically the strongest. So they're not the one that you would think of immediately like, okay, of the people of Manasseh, who can we get to? Which family should we choose to lead us into battle? They'd be the last on the list, the last chosen for that. Were you ever the last one chosen, by the way, when they were going to pick teams to do something? Yeah. So it's like, that's not a good feeling when you're the last one standing when they're trying to decide who they want. But he's like, hey, we're like the last. And then inside of his family, he's the weakest of all the family. So he's probably got some older brothers who are like bigger and stronger, and he's got other people in his family. In his father's house, he's the smallest perhaps, or he's the weakest. And he's like, I'm the weakest guy in the weakest family in the whole land. And how am I going to do this? But look at the answer in verse 16. The Lord said to him, but I will be with you, and you shall strike the Midianites as one man. That's the game changer, isn't it? And that's the thing that God wants people to know all the way through. When God is with us, when God is on our side, we can't lose. When the Lord is not going to be defeated. So when the Lord is with us, we're guaranteed the victory. And that's still the case. That we can't lose if we're in the Lord and we're on his side, because he's going to be victorious in the end. And that's all that really matters. It's not how strong you are or I am. Are we with the Lord? Is he with us? So Gideon asks for a sign. Now, if you kind of remember something about the story of Gideon, you might be thinking, ooh, I know. It's the fleece. But it's actually not there. We're getting to that one yet. We're coming to the fleece sign in just a minute. The first thing he does is he goes and he prepares a meal. And Lee, I thought about our trip to Zimbabwe, and Grant, when I read this, it says he prepared a meal of goat and bread and broth. And I was like, hey, I've had a meal like that, I think. And so he brings this goat and this broth out and some bread. And the angel says, okay, put the bread and the goat on this rock and then pour the broth over. So he soaks it. It might remind you a little bit of Elijah and the sacrifice, because something similar happens. We're told then that the angel, in verse 21, reached out the tip of the staff that was in his hand and touched the meat and the unleavened cakes, and fire sprang up from the rock and consumed the meat and the unleavened cakes. And the angel of the Lord vanished from his sight. Then Gideon perceived that he was the angel of the Lord. And Gideon said, alas, O Lord God, for now I have seen the angel of the Lord face to face. And from that moment on, Gideon had this unwavering faith that you might think, right, after seeing something like that, and after having this face-to-face personal encounter, that now he's just going to be, now he's the valiant warrior. Now he's the brave man of valor. No, we'll find out that he kind of needs continual reassurance throughout this entire story. And again, remember, the theme of the whole thing is that what God said to Paul, my power is made perfect in weakness. And I think maybe Gideon is almost like exhibit A of that. I think it'd be hard to think of somebody maybe that would be a better illustration of that principle. So before Gideon goes out to face the Midianite hordes, God sends him first on a homework assignment. He gives him some homework to do. Verse 25. That night, the Lord said to him, take your father's bull and the second bull, 7 years old, and pull down the altar of Baal that your father has, and cut down the Asherah that is beside it, and build an altar to the Lord your God on top of the stronghold there, with stones laid in due order. Then take the second bull and offer it as a burnt offering with the wood of the Asherah that you shall cut down. So now the story, it's almost like we zoom out just a little bit. You know, this whole thing was playing out there in the wine press where he's hiding. This conversation is going on between Gideon and the angel. But now if you just kind of zoom back a second, what's real close by probably? In his father's, he owned this, so probably not far from where he's standing, is an altar to Baal. And beside it, an Asherah, which was the one of the goddess of the, I think the Amalekites were one of those people. But the Baals and the Asherah were the fake gods that the people of the land worshipped. And in his own, these aren't just somewhere around in the neighborhood. These belong to his father. It becomes clear in a little bit that it seems like the villagers, maybe they all worship there because they get upset about it. And so maybe his father was kind of a leading person in the village that they lived in. I'm not sure. But this altar and this idol are there, and they belong to his father. So this is in Judges chapter 6. And you might recall that the whole reason why all this problem has come upon them is because of this idol worship, right? And it's happening right here in Gideon's family. Now, we're not told if Gideon participated in that in the past or not. I don't know. I kind of want to believe that maybe he didn't, but we don't have any reason to say one way or the other. In other words, his father owned an altar to Baal So when the family got together and worshiped this false god, was Gideon there with them? I don't know. I kind of hope he wasn't, but I don't know if he was or not. But now he's been asked, and remember who he is. He's the weakest in his whole family. He's like the runt of the litter or whatever. He's the weakest in the family, and he's been told to go and tear down his father's altar and tear down this wooden idol and build an altar to God and offer sacrifices on it there. And so we're told in verse 27, Gideon took 10 men of his servants and did as the Lord told him. But because he was too afraid of his family and the men of the town to do it by day, he did it by night. So we see Gideon's growing, isn't he? His faith is growing. He's doing what God said, but he's still afraid. That's okay. I think it's okay to be afraid as long as you're doing what God says. Would you agree? Nothing wrong with being afraid as long as we're obeying. So God tells him to do this, and God didn't say you have to do it at noon. So Gideon says, I'm going to do it, but I'm going to do it in the middle of the night where nobody can, come out and try to fight me or whatever. And so throughout the middle of the night, he takes this thing apart and offers this sacrifice. And the men of the village, of course, are furious. The next morning, they find out what he did, and they decide, we're going to kill him. Now, where's that zeal been for God? Remember, these are Israelites. And they're ready to kill Gideon because he destroyed an altar to Baal. That just tells you how far off the people were. If they had that same kind of zeal for the Lord, their true God who gave them the land, maybe they wouldn't be in this problem. But surprisingly, his father, who owned the altar, actually comes to his defense. In verse 31, Joash, that's his dad, said to all who stood against him, will you contend for Baal? Will you save him? Whoever contends for him shall be put to death by morning. If he's a god, let him contend for himself because his altar has been broken down. Well, way to go, Dad. Where's that been? Right? Because it was his altar. It was his dad's altar that they destroyed, but now his dad, maybe Gideon, I think, had awoken something in his father. Remember that he said at the beginning of it that he had heard from his family about the things that God had done. I mean, they knew who God was, and they knew those things, and Gideon knew them, and his father knew them, but it seems like they had all forgotten, and they had gone after the Baals, and now maybe his father is kind of having a reckoning, and he decides to take a stand for Gideon. Maybe it was just because that was his son, but still, I think that's commendable, and of course, we see the Lord's hand in this as well. So now that the problem had been addressed there in his own backyard, basically, it's time to face the Midianites. So verse 33 says, now all the Midianites and Amalekites and people of the east came together, and they crossed the Jordan and camped in the valley of Jezreel. But the Spirit of the Lord clothed Gideon. He sounded the trumpet. The Abiezrites were called out to follow him. And he sent messengers throughout all Manasseh. And they too were called out to follow him. And he sent messengers to Asher, Zebulun, Naphtali, and they went up to meet them. I don't have the map on the screen, but this is the same. You might recognize these tribes in this area as being basically about where we were looking at in the story of Deborah up there in the north. I think it's interesting that all these people show up for battle. And that also says that I think very often people are just looking for a leader. Jesus, remember, he saw crowds and he felt compassion for them because they were like sheep without a shepherd. They were just wandering. They didn't know what to do. And so it's surprising how often in the Bible, when somebody just decides to put their faith in God and do the right thing, that people fall in line behind them. And I think that's really interesting and encouraging. So here we see that Gideon is going to step up, and you would think, okay, now he's got this big, force he's leading them into battle, and yet he still seeks for reassurance. And this is when he asked for another sign. And this is the one where he says, okay, Lord, if you really are with me, before I go out there, before I go fight these people, let me set out a fleece, and in the morning, let the ground be dry and the fleece be wet. And so he went to sleep, and he woke up, and he went out, and the ground was dry, and he wrung out the fleece, and it was filled with water. And then he said, okay, let's try this one more time. If you're really with me, tomorrow morning, let the ground be wet and the fleece be dry. And isn't it interesting that God is indulging, if that's the right word, but he is really patient with Gideon throughout all of this. Think of the signs already. An angel had come and appeared to him and spoke to him. That should have been enough. But then the angel did a sign with the staff, burned the thing up. And God's giving him instructions and talking to him. And yet, then God does the fleece thing exactly like he asked. And then he asked for another sign. And what we see is there's no indication that God is angry or frustrated or running out of patience. He is just gently leading Gideon and building his faith and reassuring him. And I find a lot of comfort in that the Lord knows us and he knows our hearts. He knows our weaknesses. He knows when we're trying to do the right thing. And I believe Gideon here is not, unlike some other people, he's not making excuses. He's not trying to get out of what the Lord is telling him to do. He's not just throwing up things to try to avoid he's just asking for reassurance. And God gives him what he asked for, which I think is encouraging. So in Judges chapter 7, it's time for the battle. But first, there's a problem. Verse 2 says, the Lord said to Gideon, the people with you are too many for me to give the Midianites into their hand, lest Israel boast over me, saying, my own hand has saved me. God said, this is not good. Apparently, Gideon had done too good of a job of calling everybody out. So he had gone and he sent messengers out, and now he's got an army of about 32,000 to face opposition of about 135,000. So the enemy outnumbers him 5-1, and God says, I don't like those odds. You guys might get it in your head that you won this battle without me. So I'm not going to let you face them with you're outnumbered 5-1. We're going to need to whittle this army down some. You got too much strength on your side. And so you remember that the people, by the way, were serving like multiple gods at this time. They were like somewhat worshiping God, but they were also worshiping Baal and Asherah. And so God needed to make it clear that he was the one giving this victory to them. And so first they say, okay, we're going to start this in 2 steps. The first step is everybody who's scared, go home. 22,000 went home and 10,000 remained. And I almost picture as that 22,000 were leaving, Gideon started to, because he was scared too. And as he was watching those people go away, he probably related to them. I mean, he probably would have been one of those guys if it hadn't been that God was leading him and comforting him. He probably would have been the first of the line of the people headed out as soon as they said, anybody that's afraid, go home. But then that left them with 10,000. You think that would be maybe good enough, but God says, no, we need to get it smaller than that. And so he has to do this test where they go down to drink some water, and some, put their mouth down to the water. Some picked it up and drank it out of their hands. And so he said, choose the ones that did that. And that was only 300 of the 10,000 that drank that way. I don't think there's any significance to that. If you have any ideas about that, you can share it with me later. But I don't know if there's any meaning. I think it was just another way of getting it down, getting the number smaller. So we're left with 300 people to face an army of 35,000. Now, those are the right kind of odds. Because remember, the theme of the lesson, my power is made perfect in weakness. That's what God said. He needs the army to be extremely weak so that the power and the glory are obviously belong to God and not to them. And so now they're ready. And so you would think maybe now Gideon is going to, he doesn't need any more reassurance, but there's another reassurance that's given to him. In verse 9, the same night the Lord said to him, arise and go down against the camp, for I've given it into your hand. But if you're afraid to go down, you think the Lord knew he was afraid to go? He knew he was trembling. And so he said, if you're afraid to go down to the camp, then go down with Purah your servant, and you shall hear what they say. Afterwards your hand shall be strengthened to go down against the camp. I think that's really interesting. Again, we see the mercy and patience of God with Gideon here. And so Gideon and his servant Purah sneak down to the outskirts of the camp. And when they get there, they can listen to these two guys discussing a dream. And one of the guys, these are the enemies, one of them is like, I have this dream. that a cake of barley came rolling along and it crashed into a tent, and it flipped the tent over and the tent collapsed flat on the ground. And the other guy said in verse 14, "This is none other than the sword of Gideon, the son of Joash, a man of Israel. God has given into his hand Midian and all the camp." Wow. How could he possibly have known that? Well, that's the Lord at work, right? This was the miracle for Gideon's sake. He hears these two guys talking, and one of them already knows that the Lord is going to give them into the hand of Gideon, son of Joash. And so that's all Gideon needs to hear. And now finally he's ready to be the man of valor. Now he's ready to become the man that the angel saw, what he could do and what he would do. He's ready to stand up and lead these people against their enemy. But notice how they fight. It says that they had in one hand a trumpet, and in the other hand a torch inside a jar. And so they're standing there, these 300 people. Imagine it's hard to even picture, but 135,000 people camped out, ready to just go help themselves to the crops of Israel. And around those, that's a huge crowd, but 300 people around them, and they got a trumpet and they've got a torch in a jar. And verse 20 says, then the three companies, when Gideon gave the shout, the three companies blew the trumpets and broke the jars. They held in their left hands the torches and in their right hands the trumpets to blow. And they cried out, "A sword for the Lord and Gideon." And verse 21 says, every man stood in his place around the camp, and all the army ran. They cried out and fled. It's a very interesting picture. And I never really thought, well, I don't remember thinking too much about it, that if you have in one hand a trumpet and the other hand a torch, what are you not holding? Any kind of weapon, right? I don't even know if they had a sword with them. And maybe if they did, it would have been, hung on their side. But they're standing there with to blow a trumpet and to hold up a torch. And then how they engaged in a battle was they just stood their ground. That's all they did. They blew the trumpet, they held the torch. And who does the rest? God does the rest, right? God takes care of the actual victory, because when they blew the trumpet and they held up the torch and they just stood their ground, then the army, they woke up probably completely in disarray. They all start fighting each other and they start killing each other. And God uses the Amalekites and Midianites to kill themselves. And so they're all killing each other. And then meanwhile, apparently all they had to do was hold their trumpets up and their torches, and that's all they had to do. And then they chased after them, and really the battle spills over into the next chapter. There's some more details, but just for the sake of time, we're going to skip to the end of the battle. Verse 28 of chapter 8 says, so Midian was subdued before the people of Israel. Then they raised their heads no more, and the land had rest for 40 years in the days of Gideon, which is how chapter 5 ended, until another generation comes along and this cycle repeats again. And so this story of the judges really lasts for hundreds of years, if I'm not mistaken. And this was Gideon's day. And in Gideon's day, he became a mighty man of valor. Though he was the weakest in his house, the weakest clan in the tribe, though he was very afraid and needed lots of encouragement, he led the battle that day, and the Lord gave them the victory. And then there was rest from their enemies for another generation. So let's consider some lessons from this. Let's go back to 2 Corinthians 12, verse 7. 2 Corinthians 12, this is what Larry read for us right before the prayer. And notice the similarities here between what is said to Paul and the story of Gideon. Verse 7, it says, to keep me from becoming conceited, because of the surpassing greatness of the revelations, a thorn was given me in the flesh, a messenger of Satan to harass me, to keep me from becoming conceited. 3 times I pleaded with the Lord about this, that it should leave me, but he said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. Therefore, I will boast all the more gladly of my weaknesses, so that the power of Christ may rest upon me. For the sake of Christ, then, I'm content with weaknesses, insults, hardships, persecutions, and calamities. For when I am weak, then I am strong. Somehow, Paul understood that the purpose of this thorn in the flesh, whatever it was, we don't know what it was. There's speculation about it. There's some clues, but we don't really know. Whatever it was to keep him from becoming conceited. Does that remind you of something from the story of Gideon? Do you remember in the beginning, before they were ready to go into battle, the Lord said, wait a minute, we got too many folks here, lest they think that they saved themselves, right? Lest they think that the power belonged to them. We need to get rid of some folks so that we have a small group, because God's power is made perfect in weakness, so that the power and the glory belong to God. And I think Paul had to learn that same lesson. And unfortunately, it was for him a painful lesson, because it came in the form of this thorn in the flesh, some kind of thing that harassed him, that was a problem, some kind of thing that made him weak in some sense. And so it could be compared to like a weakness that he didn't want. He wanted to be strong, but the Lord said, no, this is fine. I can work through this. My power and my grace is sufficient, for my power is made perfect in weakness. And we think, like, what kind of weakness did Paul have? Well, I don't even know. But look at chapter 10 of 2 Corinthians. And what people said about Paul. 2 Corinthians 10, verse 10. These are his, critics. They say, his letters are weighty and strong, but his bodily presence is weak, and his speech of no account. Now, I don't know if that's a fair assessment. I suppose it's not a very charitable assessment. These are, in fact, his critics and his detractors, so they probably weren't being fair. Maybe it's, I would assume, overly harsh. But even if there's a kernel of truth to it, which often there is, isn't there? When somebody's criticizing, they may be exaggerating, but there's usually something that they're picking up on. There's some kernel of truth that they're zeroing in on to try to get at you. And here in this case, they say something about his bodily presence was weak, and something about his speech. People have suggested maybe he had a speech problem. That was his thorn in the flesh, or maybe there was something about him physically that he was, limited in some way. This was his problem that he wanted. He was prayed for some relief from. But God says, no, I can work with that. And I think it's interesting to just recognize that the Lord often works with people who are weak. And he often works through people who have limitations and flaws, and yet he can be glorified in that, because the power belongs to God. So it isn't that before, that the Lord is looking for who out here can serve me. Okay, I need to find somebody who is, the biggest and strongest and best at everything in the world, and that's who can be our leader. That's who I can work through to make a big impact. Maybe it's the person you would least expect who God can make an impact through, because God can work through our weaknesses. He can work through someone who is not impressive in person, who has some weakness. In fact, if you think about this, do you remember when the Lord called Moses? Do you remember what Moses said to him? He said, I can't talk very good. I'm not the right man for the job. I'm not good at speaking. How many people feel that way? I can't do this. I'm no good at speaking. I just stumble all over my words. Well, God says, I can work through you. When God called Jeremiah, do you remember what Jeremiah said? This is back in Jeremiah chapter 1. He said, Lord, you can't use me. I'm too young. And God said, don't say you're too young, for you'll go and you'll say what I tell you to say. That's Jeremiah 1, if you want to go be reminded of that. But over and over and over, I think God chose people who, in their own assessment of themselves, probably pretty accurately said, I don't know that I'm the man for the job. You remember when Peter was in the boat with Jesus, when he finally realized when they pull up the thing, he fell down on his knees and he said, Lord, depart from me, for I'm a sinful man. Over and over, the people that God chose for a task felt inadequate to do the job. Like Gideon, they're like, what? Not me. I'm nobody. I'm like, this not me. I can't talk. I'm too young. I'm too weak. Paul's got some kind of deformity or problem. And yet God chose those people over and over and over to work through, because I believe he delights in showing his power through our weakness. And let's end with 2 Corinthians 4. 2 Corinthians 4. I do have one other point after this. The 2 Corinthians 4. Verse 6 and 7. For God, who said, let light shine out of darkness, has shone in our hearts to give the light of the knowledge of the glory of God in the face of Jesus Christ. But we have this treasure in jars of clay to show that the surpassing power belongs to God and not to us. That's the whole point, right? But isn't it interesting that this is compared to a light that shines into our hearts? And Paul says we have this treasure in jars of clay. And have you ever thought about this before? But in Gideon's fight, they had a torch inside of a jar. And that was the way that the Lord gave them the victory. They crashed the jar, and there's their torch. And Paul says God has shown this light into our hearts, and we have this treasure in earthen vessels or in jars of clay. And I don't know, it seems like there's a little bit of a connection there between Gideon's day and this, and the power belongs to God and not to us. And then the last point I was going to mention before we conclude is I think it's very often the case, if we want to serve God and want to do something for him, we want to be put to use for the Lord in his service, it might be that the first step is a homework assignment. Because remember that Gideon is going to be the one that God is going to use to bring about the victory, but he says, before we go out and face the enemy, you've got a problem you need to face right here in your property, in your home, with your family. You've got to take a stand for me with your own kinsmen, and then we'll go out and we'll address the rest of the world. And in Gideon's, it wouldn't have made sense for God to deliver the people of Israel and Gideon to have an idol of Baal in his backyard. That needed to be dealt with first, right? So we need to first start by addressing the problem in ourselves, in our own heart, and our own turf, and get those idols out. Get our lives right with God, serve him in our own family, and then we can be put to use to go out and hopefully have an impact on the world around us. And remembering all the while that the power and the glory and the honor all belong to God. And he can work with you and me regardless of how we see ourselves. God could work through us because it's really all about him and his might and his power. If there's someone here this morning who needs to make your life right with the Lord, and if there's any way that we can assist, we certainly would be glad to do that if you'll let us know.